They called it an accident. They told her mother to stay quiet and move on. They said no one would believe a poor girl's truth over powerful lies. But what they didn't know was that a mother's silence can turn into the loudest revenge the world has ever heard. In a quiet Australian suburb where everyone pretended to be decent lived a girl named Lily Harper. She was kind, soft-spoken, and invisible to the world that should have protected her. Lily trusted the wrong people, and when her voice finally cracked open to speak the truth, no one listened. Not the school, not the neighbors, not the law. And when Lily was found dead, they said it was depression. Her mother, Grace Harper, knew better. This is not just a story of loss. This is a story of justice that arrived late, but arrived hard. She believed people were good. That was the first thing that made Lily different, and the first thing that broke her. Lily Harper grew up learning to say please and thank you, learning to trust adults, learning that if something felt wrong, you told someone and they would fix it. Her mother taught her that. The teachers repeated it. The world promised it quietly, the way it promises children safety without ever meaning to keep it. She was the kind of girl people overlooked. Not loud enough to be noticed, not troublesome enough to be warned about, not confident enough to demand space. She smiled easily, laughed softly, and always stepped aside to let others go first. That kindness became a target before she even realized it. It started small, the way these things always do. A look held too long. A comment that made her stomach tighten. A hand that brushed past and didn't move away quickly enough. Lily told herself she was imagining it. She didn't want to be dramatic. She didn't want to cause trouble. Everyone liked him. Everyone respected him. Who would believe her anyway? When the behavior grew bolder, when the fear followed her home and sat with her in the dark of a bedroom, Lily tried to speak. The first time, her voice shook so badly she could barely get the words out. She chose her sentences carefully, scared that if she said the wrong thing, she'd lose the little safety she still felt. The response crushed her. She was told she misunderstood. She was told not to exaggerate. She was told to be careful about making accusations. They spoke gently, but their words carried a clear message. Keep quiet. So Lily learned to swallow her fear. She learned to fold her pain neatly and hide it where no one would see. At home, she smiled for her mom, helped with chores, asked how her day was. Grace never noticed how Lily flinched when her phone buzzed, or how she avoided certain places, or how she stopped sleeping properly. At night, Lily wrote in her diary, page after page filled with things she couldn't say out loud. She wrote about feeling dirty, about feeling stupid for trusting, about wishing she could disappear just to make it all stop. Sometimes she wrote apologies, to her mom, to herself, to a future she no longer believed in. Each day became heavier than the last. School hallways felt like traps. Friendly faces felt like masks. Adults felt dangerous, not safe. Lily carried this weight alone, convinced that silence was the price of survival. The breaking point didn't come with a scream. It came quietly. One night, after another day of pretending, Lily sat on a bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Her phone lay beside her, unread messages blinking like reminders of a world she couldn't escape. She thought about telling her mum everything, but fear stopped her. Fear of being blamed, fear of not being believed, fear of becoming a burden. She chose silence one last time. When they found her, the world rushed to explain her away. They said she was sensitive. They said she struggled emotionally. They said these things happen. No one asked why. No one dug deeper. It was easier to label her fragile than to admit they had failed her. At the funeral, people cried about how sweet she was, how quiet, how polite. They praised the very traits that had left her defenseless. Grace stood there listening, feeling something inside her crack open slowly and painfully. Lily had trusted a system that was never built to protect girls like her. She had trusted adults who valued reputation over truth. She had trusted that being good would be enough. It wasn't. And long before her life ended, Lily Harper had already been abandoned by the world that promised to keep her safe. Grace Harper did not collapse when they told her. That surprised everyone, including herself. She stood there in the small, sterile room, hands folded in front of her, listening to words that felt distant and unreal, as if they were being spoken about someone else's child. The officer's mouth kept moving. Phrases like asterisk, no signs of struggle, asterisk, and asterisk, mental health concerns, asterisk, floated through the air. Grace nodded politely, the way she always had when adults spoke with authority, even when something inside her screamed that they were wrong. It wasn't until she got home that the truth began to suffocate her. Lily's shoes were still by the door, slightly muddy from the last time she'd gone out. Her jacket hung on the back of the chair, the sleeve twisted the way Lily always left it. Grace stood in the hallway for a long time, unable to move, because moving meant accepting that her daughter would never walk through that door again. The house felt wrong without her. Too quiet, too empty, like it was holding its breath. People came with casseroles and soft voices. They hugged Grace and told her how strong she was, how brave Lily had been, how sometimes these things just happen. Grace thanked them automatically. She made tea. She smiled when expected. Inside, something heavy was settling into her chest, something cold and unmovable. At night, when the house was finally empty, the questions came. Why hadn't she seen it? Why hadn't Lily said something? Why did every memory now feel like a clue she'd missed? Grace replayed moments over and over. Lily staring out the window, Lily losing weight, Lily laughing a little too loudly as if trying to convince herself she was okay. Each memory landed like a blow. A week after the funeral, Grace went into Lily's room for the first time alone. She had avoided it, terrified that touching anything would make the loss permanent. The air still smelled faintly of her daughter's shampoo. Grace sat on the bed and pressed her face into the pillow, finally letting the sobs tee out of her. It was the first time she cried without restraint, without worrying about who might see. That was when she noticed the diary. It was tucked into the bottom drawer, beneath folded jumpers and old notebooks. The cover was plain, unassuming, just like Lily. Grace hesitated before opening it, guilt and fear twisting together in her stomach. Reading it felt like an invasion, but leaving it unread felt like another betrayal. The first few pages were ordinary. Complaints about school, notes about music she liked, small hopes written in careful handwriting. Grace smiled through tears, relieved for a moment, until the tone began to change. The words grew darker, heavier. The handwriting pressed harder into the page. Lily wrote about fear, about shame, about a man whose name Grace recognized instantly, about telling someone and being dismissed, about feeling trapped inside a body that no longer felt like her own. Page after page revealed a pain so deep Grace had to stop repeatedly, gasping for breath as if the words themselves were crushing her lungs. Grace's hand shook violently. Her heart pounded with a rage she had never known. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't confusion. This was a child screaming for help and being silenced. The room spun as Grace realized the truth. Lily hadn't just died. She had been abandoned by people who were supposed to protect her, by systems designed to keep children safe, and by a world that found it easier to look away. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the diary open in front of her, reading and rereading the same pages. Grief twisted into something sharper, something more dangerous. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and focused, like a blade being slowly sharpened. The next morning, Grace went back to the police. She brought the diary. She brought screenshots Lily had saved. She brought names and dates and places. She spoke calmly, clearly, refusing to let her voice break. She believed, foolishly, that this time would be different. It wasn't. They skimmed the pages. They exchanged looks. They told her it was tragic, but difficult. They said there wasn't enough evidence. They warned her about false accusations and reputational damage. One of them gently suggested that Grace might be struggling with grief and seeing things through emotion. That was the moment something inside Grace finally snapped. She walked out of the station with the diary clutched to her chest, her hands numb, her mind frighteningly clear. The law had failed Lily in life, and it was failing her again in death. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. At home, Grace placed the diary back in its drawer, but she didn't close it away from herself anymore. Instead, she began to read it like a map. She highlighted patterns. She connected names. She noticed how often Lily wrote apologies for existing, for being a problem, for not being strong enough. Grace realized then that her daughter had been fighting alone for far too long. And as the sun set outside the kitchen window, Grace made a decision that terrified her and steadied her all at once. She would no longer be polite. She would no longer be quiet. She would no longer ask for permission to seek justice. If the world refused to defend her daughter, then she would. And from that moment on, Grace Harper was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman with the truth in her hands, and nothing left to lose. The first thing Grace learned was how quickly sympathy turns into distance when truth becomes uncomfortable. After the police station, after the gentle dismissals and careful warnings, she expected anger to cool inside her. She thought grief might soften the edges, that exhaustion would eventually force her to accept what they were telling her. Instead, something else happened. The more doors that closed in her face, the clearer everything became. It was as if a fog had lifted, revealing a system that had never been on Lily's side to begin with. Grace began making calls. She spoke to the school, to administrators who had once smiled warmly at parent-teacher meetings. Their voices changed the moment she mentioned Lily's name alongside accusations. Conversations became formal, scripted. They offered condolences again, as if grief could replace accountability. They insisted they had followed procedure, that there had been no official complaints on record. Grace listened, stunned, realizing how easily silence had been mistaken for consent. She asked them what a frightened teenage girl was supposed to do when the first attempt to speak was brushed aside. No one answered that. Instead, she was told to be careful. She was reminded that people's careers were at stake. She was advised, kindly, to think about moving forward for her own well-being. The implication was clear. Lily's suffering was tragic, but exposing it would be inconvenient. Grace hung up the phone shaking, not from fear, but from disbelief. These were educated people, parents, leaders, and yet every response sounded the same. Protect the institution. Protect the reputation. Protect the adult. The child came last. As days passed, Grace noticed something else. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. Whispers followed her in the grocery store. Someone suggested she was having a hard time coping and might be misinterpreting things. Grief, it seemed, made her unreliable in the eyes of others. She realized then how the system really worked. It wasn't just police or schools or paperwork. It was people choosing comfort over courage. It was communities protecting the familiar rather than questioning the powerful. It was the quiet agreement to pretend nothing was wrong. Grace began to feel like she was fighting something far bigger than one man or one institution. She was fighting a culture that taught girls to doubt themselves and mothers to stay polite. A culture that praised resilience while punishing honesty. One afternoon, she sat in her car outside the courthouse, watching people walk in and out with coffee cups and briefcases. This was the place where justice was supposed to live. The building looked solid, dependable, almost reassuring. But Grace knew now that justice didn't automatically belong to the vulnerable. It had to be fought for, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. She met with a lawyer who listened carefully, nodding as Grace laid everything out. When she finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. He explained the difficulties. Lack of witnesses. Time passed. Power dynamics. He spoke kindly, professionally, but his conclusion was devastating. The chances were slim. The emotional toll would be heavy. The outcome uncertain. Grace thanked him and left. On the drive home, her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wasn't naive. She understood complexity. But what crushed her was the pattern. Every step she took led to the same wall. Not enough. Too late. Too risky. That night, Grace sat on the floor of Lily's room again. She read the diary slowly, deliberately, not as a grieving mother this time, but as a witness. She noticed how Lily wrote about adults using the same phrases Grace had heard recently. We need proof. We have to be careful. It's complicated. The language of dismissal repeated itself generation after generation. Grace felt a deep, aching guilt settle in her chest. She had raised Lily to be respectful, to trust authority, to avoid conflict. Those lessons had been meant to protect her. Instead, they had left her defenseless in a world that exploited obedience. The system had not just failed Lily after her death. It had trained her to stay silent while she was alive. In the weeks that followed, Grace stopped asking for help in the ways she'd been taught. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped hoping someone else would step in and do the right thing. Each rejection hardened her resolve, turning sorrow into something disciplined and dangerous. She began to understand that justice, as it was officially defined, wasn't built for girls like Lily. It was slow, cautious, and deeply concerned with balance that always seemed to tip toward those with power. The law spoke in neutral terms, but neutrality, Grace now saw, often favored the guilty. What frightened her most wasn't the cruelty. It was the calmness with which people accepted it. One evening, as she filed away yet another unanswered email, Grace whispered aloud, "They are never going to help her." Saying it made it real. Saying it hurt. But saying it also freed her. Because if the system would not defend her daughter, then expecting it to do so was a waste of time. And Grace Harper no longer had time to waste. She looked around the house, at Lily's photos, her drawings, her abandoned plans of the future, and felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about truth being buried under procedure, about a child being erased to preserve comfort. The system had drawn its line, and unknowingly, it had pushed Grace across one of her own. From that moment on, she stopped believing justice would be handed to her. She understood she would have to take control of the narrative herself, piece by piece, truth by truth, not with noise or rage, but with patience and precision. Because when institutions close ranks, they don't expect the quiet ones to fight back. And that, Grace decided, would be their biggest mistake. Some wounds never heal, but some truths refuse to stay buried. Lily's voice was silenced, but her story was not. And in a world that chose comfort over courage, one mother chose to stand where everyone else turned away. Justice didn't come the easy way. It came through truth, through persistence, and through a love that refused to be quiet.